Hey, what's up, A-Push kids? We're back for our next lecture in AP US History. Today we're going to be covering topic 6.10, the Farmers' Protest. Our learning objective today is learning objective 6K, explain the similarities and differences between the political parties during the Gilded Age. We have three key ideas for us today. Our first one is improvements in mechanization helped agricultural production increase substantially and contributed to a decline in food prices. Followed up by many farmers responded to the increasing consolidation in agricultural markets and their dependence on the evolving railroad system by creating local and regional cooperative organizations. So let's kind of get talking about farmers during this particular era. During this time, new agricultural technology are going to make farming on the Great Plains easier than ever before. Some of those new pieces of farming technology, including John Deere's new steel plow, sometimes known as the sod buster, it made tilling the land more effective, and new water pump technology is going to make irrigating fields easier in the arid West. In addition to this, we're also going to have Joseph Glidden's barbed wire is going to end the era of the open range. And all of these things combine for the fact that we're going to see increasing yields across the farming sector of the United States. And what that means simply is that farmers are going to produce more crops. In total, we're going to see more crop production across all of the United States. However, because of this, what we see is crop prices are going to fall. Right? And it's a basic kind of economic idea here is that whenever you have supply going up, in a way, and you don't have an equal increase in the demand for that product, the price of that product is going to fall. And so this is going to be one of the major problems that Western farmers are going to face, is that although we're going to see an increase in overall production, farmers are doing better than they've ever done before. They're growing more food than they've ever grown before. They're actually earning less money than they ever have before. In addition to this as well, what's also going to start to happen is they're going to be charged higher interest rates by mortgages from different banks. And also, to get these new pieces of technology, farmers are going to have to purchase them by financing them, which causes them to incur more and more debt. And finally, the other major problem that their farmers are facing at this particular time is that railroads are charging higher and higher prices for their shipping rates for different crops. And as we can kind of see from the image right there, you see the train kind of coming along the tracks, and we see that you've got all of these farmers that are laid across the roads. They're about to be run over and destroyed and killed by this oncoming train. And this is because the farmers have now become completely dependent upon the railroads. In the West, to be able to get your crops to market, you had to use the railroads. You couldn't put your stuff onto a barge and ship it by waterways. Now you had to rely on the railroads. And what this led to is that we see the railroad systems, what they're doing is they're able to now recognize this and take advantage of the farmers by charging them ever higher and higher prices for shipping. In addition to this, the other major issue that farmers are facing is they are facing what is called a liquidity crisis. There is not enough money that's out there. And so we have to talk for just a second about the money supply issue that's happening in the United States. So during the Civil War, the government had printed a lot of paper money. And these were oftentimes called greenbacks. Sometimes today our current currency is called greenbacks. If you'll take a dollar bill, the backside of it, the printing is green, even to this day. Now, what this had led to is this had led in the money supply, the surplus had led to inflation. And this is the general rising of all prices. And typically we don't love inflation. All right? Most people don't love it when prices go up on things. And so after the war, the government had tried to deflate the money supply, to try to bring it down. So they withdrew the paper money and returned us to the gold standard. And what that means is that the amount of money in circulation was based on the amount of gold that was out there. So the money supply would only increase when the amount of gold that was in U.S. Federal Reserves would increase. So there was only more money whenever we would discover more gold in the ground. So what happened as a result of this is we had deflation. Now that lowered prices, which seems really good. I like the idea of lower prices. I'm sure you guys do too. But the problem is that farmers who are already facing the pinch from overproduction and lowering farm prices, when prices go down now even more, this puts them into an even bigger bind. These lower prices meant farmers might be unable to repay their debts, not only on the mortgages for their farms, but also for their equipment as well, and they could face financial ruin. Just to kind of put some numbers to this, for instance, let's say that year one price index is 100. Okay, your total income is $1,200. Now, what we see here is this is deflation. All right, total income goes down. Farm expenses, living expenses, they go down, but not a whole lot. Loan payments don't change, and that means overall net income for farmers in deflation goes way, way down. However, conversely, we can look at the same idea here. The price index, we see it going up, and simply what that means is that we have inflation. Total income goes up, farm supplies and living expenses, they go up as well, but not quite as much. Loan payments stay the same, but notice how net income now has increased significantly. Therefore, what we should take from this knowledge is that for farmers, what they wanted to see is they wanted to see an increase in inflation because this would help them. And the way that you increase inflation is you increase the money supply. So keep that in mind for just a second. Now, all of these issues with the money supply, issue with railroad regulations, overproduction, problems with banks, what this is going to do is this is going to cause and convince Western farmers that they need to start to organize. And they do start to organize, though fairly inefficiently early on. They start to form some groups, such as the Grangers and the Farmers Alliance, were two different groups that they start to develop during this time. And we see that they demand several things, such as the regulation of the railroads and regulation of banks. They also organize together to form co-ops, they form their own banks, they form their own silos, and they even start to run some political candidates and win seats in Congress and win local elections, especially in western states like Illinois, etc. However, generally, they fail to improve farmers' lives because although they win local elections, they can't win national elections. And railroads, because they cross state lines, they are regulated by federal laws. And therefore, farmers soon realize that to really make any lasting change, they're going to need to be able to win elections on a national level, leading us to key idea number 3. Which says, economic instability inspired agrarian activists, that's farmers, to create the People's, otherwise known as the Populist Party, which called for a stronger governmental role in regulating the American economic system. So in 1890, the Westerners formed a new political party to bring about reforms, and this was called the Populist Party. Now they demanded an end to pro-business, laissez-faire policies, and began to regulate railroads to force them to lower rates on farmers. Now remember that laissez-faire, that means hands-off or no government intervention. They wanted a national income tax to take the tax burden off of farmers, and they called for an amendment to allow citizens, not state legislatures, to directly elect senators. And this was because they believed, and in part rightly so, that many of these senators were basically in the pockets of these large businesses and especially the railroads. Now, they're going to be very much urged on in 1893 when the economy crashed in what was called the Panic of 1893. And this resulted in several things. Several major corporations went bankrupt, 16,000 businesses disappeared. This triggered a stock market crash. There's overextended investments. And the bank failures are going to follow, causing a contraction of credit. Nearly 500 banks are going to close. And unemployment in the country reaches nearly 3 million people. In response to this economic crash, Jacob Coxey, who's a farmer, is going to, from Ohio, leads a protest march by unemployed workers from the United States to Washington, D.C., called Coxey's Army. Now, what this does is it demonstrates the growing frustration with conservative economic practices, and it starts to bring in as well industrial workers into this view that the economic system was not working for them. Therefore, from 1890 to 1896, the Populist Party was an influential third party and challenged the Democratic and Republican parties. Now, during this time, 3 governors, 10 congressmen, 5 senators were all elected as populist candidates. And in 1892, the Populists ran James Weaver for president, and he'll win several western states, but will lose. Now, 1896 is going to be the next really big election. And in it, bimetallism becomes the most important issue. And we'll talk about what bimetallism here is in just a second. Now, for the Republicans, William McKinley is going to run, and he stands upon the gold standard, as you can see on his campaign advertisement there. Against him, the populist candidate William Jennings Bryan supported this idea of bimetallism, and he'll be supported not only by the populists but also by the Democratic Party as well. Now, populists demanded this idea called bimetallism. Now, bimetallism means using a currency based on the gold and silver standards. Now, what this would do is it would use 2 different metals to base all paper currency on. And if you increase the number of metals, you're going to increase the amount of currency. And with that, you're going to increase inflation, which is something that Western farmers are going to want. Because of this, in 1896, the Democratic Party will also nominate William Jennings Bryan as well as their candidate. And he'll actually be on the ticket for both people, causing a little bit of confusion when people go to the polls, and his name appeared as both the populist candidate and the Democratic candidate as well. Now, during the election, William Jennings Bryan is going to give a dramatic cross of gold speech. It's very, very important, very popular, and it explains the disastrous effects of the gold standard on the working class and Americans. And this really highlights the divide between the working class and the Western class versus the business and urban class in the United States. However, despite Bryan's success among farmers in the West, McKinley wins the election. And as president, McKinley is going to return to the gold standard, and he kills the bimetallism movement. Now, after the election of 1896, the Populist Party dies. And although they're very short-lived, really only about 6 years, they are an important political party in U.S. history. Because although as a party they die, their ideas live on. Ideas such as the income tax, the direct election of senators, and regulations of the railroads, which will all be enacted during our next unit, during the Progressive Era, which lasts from 1890 to 1920. Well, that's all our notes for today. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. And until next time, and as always, go Pack.